We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Look to Sun Yat-sen, Taiwan's Ma Ying-jeou urges on landmark mainland China trip. Yesterday, the second day of his historic trip to the mainland, Ma paid tribute to Sun at his mausoleum in Nanjing, praising the late leader for his efforts in shaping what the Chinese race should be today. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He's a writer, a journalist, and host of the YouTube program, The New Atlas, Brian Berletic. Brian, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So Ma Ying-jeou has called on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait to avoid war and look to the lofty ideals of the late Sun Yat-sen in founding Asia's first republic. Brian, talk about this trip from a couple of perspectives. One is in terms of timing. It's not only important that things happen, but it's also important when things happen. And it really seems as though that Ma is there on a more grassroots mission, and because he's talking about the Taiwanese and the Chinese being one people, and putting this in a much broader historic context. Brian Berletic.
Those are all very good points. The timing is crucial. It comes at a time when U.S. and Chinese tensions continue to rise, and this is specifically over the status of Taiwan. And it also comes at a time where Ukraine is being utterly destroyed by proxy war. And anyone who is thinking reasonably and is on the island of Taiwan has to understand that that is going to be their fate as well. So you cannot blame Ma Ying-jeou for going to the mainland and trying to introduce a reasonable narrative to what has been coming out of Taipei over the last several years, actually, since the new administration, Tsai Ing-wen, and the Democratic Progressive Party came to power in 2016.
You know, I think it's if you look at the sites that he's visiting, if you look at the things that he's doing culturally, it's very powerful. You know, in that the Russians argued that they were one people with Ukraine and they prefer not to have a war. And of course, the U.S. had been working in Ukraine for many, many years to Nazify Ukraine and to separate them. And I think that dynamic doesn't exist in Taiwan. And based on what happened the last election, it looks like there certainly is a lot of room for the people of Taiwan to both learn from Ukraine and to recognize, you know, their cultural heritage is tied to the people on the mainland China rather than Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan.
Again, another good point. And what people have to remember is that even though the Western media refers to Taiwan as Taiwan, it's the government there is actually referred to as the Republic of China versus the People's Republic of China on the mainland. And they are all Chinese and they speak Chinese, and virtually everyone on the island can trace their ancestry back to people who came over from the mainland. And so it's even more senseless than what the U.S. has gotten going in Ukraine. And if you look at what the U.S. has been doing on the island, they are actually going into the educational system, going through the media, and encouraging separatism and encouraging manufactured artificial identity to create artificial division and really get the proxy war going.
Is Ma going to Beijing on this trip?
I don't think he was originally supposed to.
Okay.
I don't know if that changed, but originally he wasn't supposed to.
Yeah, I was trying to see.
I know originally he wasn't supposed to.
Right.
When I read about his trip at first, there was no Beijing on that. In fact, one place it said that he wasn't going to go. I
was asking that because if he were going to Beijing, that would be an incredibly important visit. The symbolism behind his doing that, and I was going to contrast that with Tony Blinken not being allowed to go to Beijing, which is why Blinken didn't go to China. Any thoughts there, Brian, in terms of Ma not going to Beijing but still going on the trip, Tony Blinken not being allowed to go to Beijing and canceling the trip?
Yes, I think Ma Ying-jeou going to tour the rest of China is still extremely important. I don't think any former president or high-level politician like that has gone to the mainland in decades. And then as far as the United States goes, I think China is resigned to the fact that the U.S. It has no interest in actually talking with China. They want to talk at China. And so China has no motivation or incentive to pick up the phone and talk with the United States, not with the president, not with the Secretary of State.
Al Jazeera reports, and this is related, China vows to fight back if U.S. Speaker meets Taiwan president. And in the same way then, when a few weeks back or a month or so back, China released, a couple of different documents documenting the results of U.S. hegemony. When China fights back, it's diplomatic, it's intellectual. It's not like, okay, we're going to throw rocks and bombs at you. And I think part of the fighting back, part of that is I would call it courting people from Taiwan, politicians, and offering peaceful resolution to the Taiwanese people in a subtle manner. Your thoughts?
I think that's a very good point. It's very obvious that China wants a peaceful, mutually beneficial reunification with Taiwan. They're quite okay with it taking a long time, going along as fast as everyone on both sides of the strait wanted to go. What they don't want is the U.S. Interjecting into this process, trying to introduce hostilities, separatism, and violence. Time is on China's side, and for the United States, they are getting weaker by the year drastically. This year, things are happening so quickly, much faster than I think anyone expected. China knows time is on their side. So the U.S. is really interested in speeding up the process of separatism and triggering some sort of violence before the window of opportunity closes entirely.
In this Al Jazeera piece, they say China has threatened to, quote, resolutely fight back, end quote. And that's very strong language, especially coming from China, who tends to be a little more subtle in their communications. I don't think that's subtle at all. And this seems to be an ongoing escalation of rhetoric from China. Your thoughts on what does this language mean, the type of language, and how should Americans pay attention to how China is communicating? And also, it's saying that Kevin McCarthy is expected to meet with Tsai Ing-wen, but that hasn't been confirmed. Is it possible that McCarthy won't meet with her the same way he chose not to go to Taiwan?
It's hard to say. The United States is very interested in provoking. This is all they really seem to understand and know how to do. They really don't seem to have a reverse gear. I'd be very surprised if that meeting didn't take place. What we see the United States doing with China, and also what they've been doing with Russia through their proxy war in Ukraine, they have been putting themselves into the corner. They're painting themselves into a corner with absolutely no way to get out. Every time they push on China regarding Taiwan, China very smartly avoids the type of escalation the U.S. would like to provoke. And instead, they do these very careful. Last time when Nancy Pelosi visited, they did this blockade of the airspace and the sea lanes. And they're demonstrating what they could do. The U.S. is trying to provoke some sort of war or invasion. But I think what would be most devastating of all would be a blockade, simply a blockade.
Yeah, and again, as we said, and what's most devastating is patience. It's
or most frustrating.
Exactly, to the U.S. because they need China to do something to give them some kind of a trigger. And if China, even if it's just for sanctions, and if China does nothing, it just makes them more difficult if China waits them out. Interesting article, RT. Zelensky explains why he won't withdraw from key Donbass city if Russia captures Artyomsk, which we often in the West know as Bakhmut. Ukrainians will demand that their government looks for a compromise with Moscow, the president said. Here's the problem with that. the Russians are eventually going to capture Artyomov/Bakhmut. So he's going to throw all his troops in there to hold on to this city, which he can't hold on to forever. So he gets another couple weeks, so he gets another couple months, so he gets 6 months. At some point, it's going to fall, and it's a kind of just almost like a desperation. We've got to hold on to this. We don't have a plan afterwards, but we're going to hold on to this for now.
Let me add one more thing. Zelensky says if the troops were to surrender, his government would come under domestic and international pressure to seek peace with Russia, as though he isn't currently under domestic and international pressure to seek peace. Brian.
Yes. Yes. If you look at the whole interview, nothing he says makes any sense. He's talking about somehow maintaining some sense of victory by holding this territory. But this entire conflict has been about attrition, not territory. And as was just pointed out, they're losing their best men. Their best equipment is being thrown into the conflict. All of these tanks that were being sent, we're hearing about them getting closer and closer to Bakhmut specifically. So it's a war of attrition, and the longer he keeps it going, and it's a war of attrition that Ukraine is losing, the longer he keeps it going, the worse they're going to lose it, and the harder it's going to be to go to the negotiation table with any imaginable leverage at all.
Also implicit in this discussion is that he's going to have the opportunity to seek peace at the end of this thing. That, yeah, they're going to keep pushing me, and sooner or later I'll have to make a deal. When you're laying on your back and you got to say, uncle, that ain't a deal. And I see the conclusion of this not from a deal, but from an unconditional surrender. But I guess you could consider an unconditional surrender a deal.
Well, as I've been saying, Garland, I think they need to fire up the USS Missouri, because they're going to float that rascal into the Black Sea and get the Japanese emperor to sign the deal. Brian.
It's a good point, and that is what we're looking at. Where if you go back to when the Minsk agreement was still an agreement, that was the best deal of all, and they should have taken it, but they didn't. And then right after Russia went into Ukraine, there was another opportunity for some sort of deal. They didn't take it. They lost more territory. Now they're looking at the loss of Bakhmut. Avdiivka is also encircled and likely to fall. And even if this spring offensive somehow materializes in some sort of territorial gain for Ukraine, it'll be temporary because, again, this is a war of attrition. Russia is ready to fight this for the long term. Ukraine and its Western sponsors have already demonstrated they're incapable of doing that. Just as time was on China's side regarding Taiwan, time is on Russia's side regarding Ukraine. And the longer they let this go, the less leverage Ukraine is going to have.
And really quickly, we have just about a minute left. I saw on the news last night that Zelensky was visiting the troops. They showed him walking through trenches and talking to soldiers who kind of looked pretty disgusted at the whole conversation. And we hear now that some 14 tanks are coming in. The West here is getting it as though there's time here. And to your point, I'm wondering, what are they expecting to happen and how? And that's a hell of a question to ask in 30 seconds, but we got 30 seconds.
It is very hard to answer at all because, again, it comes down to things like artillery shells, tanks. You cited 14 tanks. Russia has well over 1,000. They can produce well over 1,000 every single year. It's just so completely lopsided in Russia's favor. I think they're just kicking the can down the road as long as they possibly can with no real plan.
That's the best answer we've heard to date. Brian Berletic, thank you. Kicking the can down the road, that's all this is. Or maybe the depleted uranium. Brian Berletic, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that analysis. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks, you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's another hour on the other side. Stay tuned.